Okay, in that case, I'll introduce our speaker for this evening, although you hardly needs introduction for most of us who are very familiar to Barrie Hartwell. And as I say, although an Englishman by birth, Barrie spent most of his life in living and studying and working in Northern Ireland. So I think we can claim him as one of our own. Barrie came to Queen's in 1968 to study archaeology, and he followed on joining the department as a research assistant working for Professor Martin Jope, and in due course established a photographic studio in Darkroom and took responsibility for the artefact teaching collection. As a senior year research officer, he specialised in air photography, taught modules in artefact studies, site location techniques, and ran the Easter Field School. Discoveries from his aerial surveys have led to some of the most important excavations in Northern Ireland, including Donegal Hill and Navan, at Hockey's Fort, and of course the Giant's Ring. I say, although Barrie officially retired in 2010, he still looks after the teaching collection on a voluntary basis and has been actively involved for many, many years with the UAS, serving on the committee as past president from 2010 to 2015, and he did a spell as honorary secretary as well. And he has recently published his long-awaited book on Ballynahatty, which some of you may have seen, and I thoroughly recommend. So it's with great pleasure then I hand over to Barrie for this evening's lecture on Ballynahatty Neolithic Temple Complex. Thank you.
First of all, can I do a sound check? Can you hear me okay? I've got this mic on, it's not blurring you or anything. There you go. All right. Click on there. Well, this excavation, the Ballynahatty excavation, really lasted for really quite some time. It was a research excavation. It started because of aerial photography and discovering a particular site, which we later called Ballynahatty 5 and Ballynahatty 6. And that excavation went on from 1990 right through until the year 2000. So it's a 10-year research excavation. A lot of data was generated, and it's quite a lot to get through just in this time. I've got to work out how to change my things here. There we go. Well, look, 10 years, a lot of people have been involved in the Ballynahatty excavation in one way or another, actually participating in it in terms of the excavators, the backup from that, and eventually through to the publication of the excavation. So I'm just sort of flashing this up just in case, the remote possibility that there may be somebody here that actually worked on the excavation. But these are the people that really I need to thank. Those are half the people I need to thank. I think I can find the rest of them. There we go. And there are some more people. In terms of the Ulster Archaeological Society, though, there are two more people, because although some people worked on the excavation for 1 year or 2 years or 3 years or something like that, there were two people that worked on it really for the guts of 10 years. And you probably recognize these two. Unfortunately, both late members, a former president and a former honorary secretary. Sad to see them go, but nice to see them in the sort of situation that I think they'd like to be remembered in. Now, in addition to that, I should thank right at the very start what would be now the Department of Communities, I think it is, and Queen's University, who during all this time supplied me with either the money, the wherewithal to continue, or with the backup as well to process the results. So let's head on and just look at what we know now about the Ballynahatty area. And of course, if you go up there now, this is what you see. You see the Giant's Ring, and you see a pile of stones, which is probably a passage tomb, an early passage tomb. And you also see an isolated stone that sits out in the fields, probably a standing stone, quite important. And now when you see it in that picture up there, surrounded by a few other stones, and those are not original, they've been turned up by the plough, but also emphasizes the fact that this is all a glaciated landscape. I suppose you could say it's a fluvio-glacial landscape with all that we associate with that, with mixes of glacial sands, gravels, rubble, lumps of rock, all this sort of stuff. And probably the stones that constitute this passage tomb are probably glacial erratics. And there's evidence of one other megalithic chamber that was destroyed 150 years ago. And these were all probably glacial erratics. And when those glacial erratics were used up in the building of these tombs, then they had to resort to something else, which I'll come across, I'll talk about in a while. So let's go and look at some of David Craig's excellent pictures taken from a drone survey, just to, again, to set the Giant's Ring, the Ballynahatty area in a context. And here we are now looking really over towards County Down Hills. And just here, does that come out? Yes, it does. Just here is the standing stone. There, of course, is the passage tomb in the middle of the Giant's Ring, and then you have the Giant's Ring henge sitting there. And looking at it from the other direction, south of the Giant's Ring, looking towards the north, we see the hills of County Antrim, and off to the right-hand side at the top, we see Belfast, and where we are at the moment, Queen's University. So we're not that far away from Belfast. We're only, what, 6, 7 kilometres, something like that, from Belfast, and therefore only 6 or 7 kilometres from the sea and from Belfast Lough. Now positioning ourselves just a little bit further over, and we're now looking down towards the southwest, and again the extension of the County Antrim Hills, and looking more or less south. And what we can see just on the edge of the plateau of Ballynahatty, we can see the village of Edenderry. And Edenderry, of course, is on the River Lagan. So that's where the River Lagan is, at the end of those houses. And the Lagan curls round this plateau on which Ballynahatty sits. And I like to think of it as being a loop in the Lagan as opposed to the bend in the Boyne. I think we have our own sort of little area here. The prehistoric cemetery. So apart from those 3 visible items, there is the prehistoric cemetery, which is an extensive, very intensive cemetery on the fields spreading out on the north and the west of the henge itself. And I will attempt to, if I can do that. Which one am I doing wrong here? I need... That one. Thank you. Okay. Yes. So, and again, using David's drone photographs, and he, from those photographs, produced a model of the landscape. And so we can look at that, and I hope we can zoom in to look at this landscape in greater detail. So we can fly around it. I'm not a very good flyer. I'm a bit shaky at this, but you get the idea, because there are certain things which I want to point out to you which are really, really important in this landscape. One of them is the fact that it does sit on the edge of one side. We've got, say, the loop and the lag. We've got the lagan, and on the other side, we've got an area around here. Yeah, an area around here, which is a fairly steep slope, and that slope extends on round here, and it extends round in this direction as well. So if I pull it round and run down here, like this, you can see the slope running around like this. Now, nowhere is it a prohibitive slope. You can walk up it anywhere, but visually, it separates this area from the surrounding zone, the surrounding land. And we go around a little bit further. Zoom in. So, whoops. So we can see that we're now sitting over the top of Edenderry, looking approximately east across the fields. What I want you to notice is this hump in the fields, which in fact is a ridge. So if we go down like this, oops. There we go. This ridge is really all important. It looks very subtle, and the height of it is really the same height as the bank here, and it's the same height as the other highest point in this plateau, which is just over here. But it's not particularly high, and yet it's very, very important. When we look down on it like this, we can see this thing here, which is probably a early medieval ring fort. We've got the structure which we call BNH5 and BNH6, BNH standing for Ballynahatty, and not my name. And here it is, this structure, the outer enclosure, Ballynahatty 5, BNH5, and the smaller one, BNH6. So if I talk about those two, BNH6 is the small one, BNH5 is the big one. Our excavations all took place at this end of it. But if you notice, there are lots of other things coming up in this landscape. So here, for example, series of ring ditches, probably Bronze Age. You can see a line of 3 and another one there, 4, and there's a double one in there, 6. But then we look further around and we can begin to see other things. I don't know if you can see if we can pull ourselves over on this side. Whoops, there we go. And can you see here, there is a circle of, of pitch, which are probably, presumably, timber circle, round just in here. And then, of course, we have this long line which runs across here. Could this be a cursus? Middle Neolithic cursus? It's a possibility. If you look, curious enough, it's heading for this dip, which is above Edenderry. But it doesn't look like something which is modern, which would be, if it's relatively modern, the parallel lines would probably be parallel, but these are a little bit more ramshackle. There's a bend which seems to run around this house, but this house is built on a farmhouse, and the farmhouse is built on a cemetery mound. So this could have been constructed to go round a prehistoric feature. So lots of things begin to appear, and of course, more ring ditches around here. And each of these little dots that you see scattered around here are all perforations through the topsoil into the subsoil. So these are coming up as crop marks. And potentially, each of those things could be kiss burial or what have you, because we know that there's a lot of things happening here. I don't want to talk really much more about this, but I want to get onto the excavation. So we may just come back to this area again, though, but as I say, the important thing is looking at this ridge. Let's see if we can go down a little bit further so you get a better impression of it. Okay, so I think there you see the combination of the two, and the fact that the site that we're talking about is on the edge of this ridge here. Right, I'll attempt to go back again. Ah, yes. So, just to sort of confirm these things as well, here are just 2 or 3 pictures which show you stills. And here we have the Ballynahatty 5 and 6 enclosure, and you can see the way it's positioned on the edge of this ridge. And as a summary of all those photographs, this is what the busy landscape looks like for the prehistoric cemetery. Also notice that if we look up at the top part up here, there's nothing there, but then there are houses there. These fields were in grass, so they didn't tend to come out as well in terms of crop marks, but a few bits and pieces did, so there are clearly other things happening there. And 1 or 2 things came up in this field, and that was under a different crop, so that's why that's not really showing anything. And so Edenderry is down here, and the edge of the plateau extends along here. So this is a very extensive cemetery. It's a mortuary landscape. And Ballynahatty 5 and 6 is part of that mortuary landscape. So let's look at the excavation. There's a picture of taken in around about 1995, showing the excavation underway, and you can see where it is on that position of that ridge and how close it is to the Giant's Ring henge. The earliest things that we found in the excavation, there was no context for this. These bits and pieces are really in the topsoil, but a carinated bowl and a globular bowl show that, in fact, there's occupation in there in the Ballynahatty area during the earlier part of the Neolithic. Now, one thing that you should also bear in mind is that probably the passage tomb within the Giant's Ring henge is probably quite early. Alison Sheridan gave a very good talk last week about this, and I think convincingly suggested that we could be earlier 4th millennium for a date for this. So that passage tomb is right at the beginning of the occupation in this area. But during the excavation, we found this structure here. So this has got nothing to do with the timber enclosures, but is clearly earlier. And unfortunately, you can see that in prehistory, a line of posts was dug through here, and it went through the side of this chamber. And this line just missed it as well. So let's just have a look at this, because it's important in terms of looking at the development of the cemetery and the development of the area. So here we have the chamber. You can see that this is where the post hole ran through the side of it. We have a line of uprights. Now, these are not the big stones, these are small stones. Remember when I said I was talking earlier on about the passage tomb in the Giant's Ring, and possibly these were glacial erratics, and maybe that all the glacial erratics were unfortunately used up in the construction of those monuments. This is constructed basically with field stone, although these flat stones were brought in from somewhere else, but this is all real field stone that's collected. But if you look at it, and over here we have it in plan, this is right at the very start when we were going down through it. These things here are the capstones that have been smashed to pieces by the later post hole. When we took that off and excavated down, we could see these are the small uprights in the chamber, and this is the flat stone base. And looking at it from the side, there were 2 pots, and both of these pots have been broken. They've been smashed by the post hole that went through. And these are the 2 pots that were found. Now, they're in very poor condition. They were originally they were really pretty crappy pottery, quite frankly. They virtually fell to pieces. One of them is still in situ there. You can see it being left there. Both had remains of cremations in, but because of the post hole, there were bits of pottery and bits of cremated bone scattered throughout the fill of the chamber, and then down through the post hole as well. Now, 1855 passage tomb, simply because it was found in 1855. And this is what it looked like. This is taken from the Ulster Journal of Archaeology. And we can see a nice plan of it. And this is the material that came from it. Cremated material and unburnt bone and some cattle material in here. So without really spending much more time on that, let me just go on and look at this. And this sort of sums up what we might call tombs in the passage tomb tradition. Material of the passage tomb tradition. So here down is our passage tomb within the Giant's Ring, Henge. This is the site that I've just been talking about. That was found on the corner of the excavation over here. And then we found this one. And this is even smaller. Look at the size of the bowl and look at the scale. This is just half a meter. This is 1 meter. And there's a smaller 1 meter there. So this is really quite small, just about the size of a pot. It's like a little buried kiss that runs down. But the curious thing about it is that if you look at the uprights here, they're just little pebbles. So they're just notional uprights. But just bear in mind, look at the shapes that we're dealing with here. Look at the shape of this here, the shape of this here, with a threshold and a short passage, and the shape of this as well. There's a similarity running through all these things. And I think that's the passage tomb in the Giant's Ring is a founder tomb, and these other structures are really mimicking that as well. But they're all sunk down on the ground because the stones are small. You couldn't really put them on ground level. They're all sunk down in the ground. And they were originally probably covered over by stones and stone cairns. When we look at what they contained, and Eileen Murphy has done quite an interesting study of these, we can see that there's really quite a variety. You'd have nothing from the tomb in the Giant's Ring, that's been long destroyed. From this one here, we had 2 disturbed pots. We had a mature adult, a late teen, and a child. Up here, there are a line of 4 pots, which we found, and they included 2 mature adults and 1 child, aged about 9 and 10. Up here, we can add 2 more sites which we found during the excavation. One was in a simple stone setting of split stones, which was this one here, which held a female somewhere between the age of 30 and 40, and another one, which we found, which had another child of age 4 or 5. And then the 1855 tomb had 2 females, 2 mature males, another mature female, 1 juvenile. In other words, there's a complete mix. We don't know the status of these people, but we do know that they're not dealing purely with males or purely with females, but young, old, male, female. Now, also with the 1855 tomb, there was unburnt bone as well. And that unburnt bone, let's go to the next one, because the interesting thing is when we look at the dates of these, right? So we're assuming that early 4th millennium for the passage tomb, but look at the approximate dates. 3350 to 2935, 3360 to 31, 3310 to 2910, 3340 to 3025, 3343 to 3020 for the skull, for one of those disarticulated skulls, not necessarily the cremated remains, but for the skull. Skull is put in later, so that doesn't necessarily date the tomb, but I imagine the tomb would come out as being approximately the same date. They're all coming out at more or less the same period. So there's clearly, if you like, a passage tomb tradition horizon in Ballynahatty, which becomes quite important. The farmer that found This tomb, Bodle, also said there were exactly similar tombs found in 3 of his neighbours' lands, around here, here, and down here. So, surrounding the whole area and surrounding the early passage tomb, we have this as a passage tomb horizon. So let's look at the timber enclosures now. So here we are. There's our two excavators again. This is during the excavations, unfinished excavation of Ballynahatty 6. But again, so you can see just the sort of the position of it here. But we'll go on a little bit further and look at the results of the 10 years of excavation. And you won't thank me for going through each of the individual post holes. There were over 300 of them. So I'm going to look at them in groups, briefly go through them in groups and look at 1 or 2 of the post holes in more detail, because it basically comes down to 2 different types of post hole. But these are the groups that we deal with. So we have what we call BNH6, the inner enclosure, and we can look at it in terms of a square central structure, 4 posts here, here, and here, and then 2 rings of post holes running round and a clear entrance, the IR inner ring, OR outer ring. Then the eastern settings, simply called eastern settings because when we excavated them, they were east of the other one. For no other reason than that. This one was excavated, and this sort of comes out in the aerial photographs and a geophysical survey that we found another one over this side. So I think we have a duplication. Then we have the bigger enclosure, BNH5, the inner ring and the outer ring running around through here, running along here, and then going all the way around 100 meters down the field, and then coming back again. That's the larger enclosure. And the entrance to that is just here. Then there's another line of posts which run here, which we simply call the north-south posts. Couldn't think of anything better to call them. I'll talk a little bit about those again. Then attached to the outside of that, we have what we called the annex at the time, which is really just an entrance structure, a big entrance structure though. And in order to, again, to try and determine these posts, give them another name, these were the northern east-west posts, the new posts. Then we have the main facade, the inner, middle, and outer facade, which runs down here like this. And then flipped over, let's get back again. Then we have the west-northwest post running along here. And we have the southern east-west post running along here like this. And then finally, we have the entrance chamber along here associated with the gap. Those small cremations that I talked about, the line of 4 of them ran down here like this, and then the sunken chamber was just in here. So it's probably easier to see if we look at just the position of the posts themselves, as opposed to the post holes. And it becomes, I think, a little bit clearer. The cremations, the other cremations I talked about, the ones which didn't really have stone settings, were here. There's one just at this point here, and there's another one at this point over here. Right, let's just focus in a little bit on the inner enclosure. Now you can see that the posts are numbered. There were 33 in the outer ring, 25 in the inner ring. So when you look at this, you can see that it seems to form a perfect circle apart from this area here. There is a flattening of the front of this. So clearly there was a desire to emphasize probably a facade on that point there. Now, during the excavation, what we found, in fact, was that there were the remains of a plank was found, just one charred plank. So the probability is that this flattened facade actually was a planked facade. We don't know. I'll talk about the rest of it in a moment. This part here, these posts were shallower. These post holes were approximately 2 meters deep, at least 2 meters deep, because we could only pick up the posts once we got down about 30 to 40 centimeters. It was very difficult to define the post holes. So they were at least 2 meters in depth. And what you've got to think of with any of these posts is that if something is 2 meters deep, how tall is it going to be? And as a general rule of thumb, if you're putting in a post in the garden, putting in a fence or something, or a fence post, you think about, let's say, the aerial part being 3 times the depth. There's a rough rule of thumb. So we might think, initially at least, of these posts being approximately 6 meters high. Now that's really that's running up to the ceiling here, right? These are making tall posts. And the size of them varies a little bit, but they're probably 30 to 40, some cases 50 centimeters in diameter. So we're not just thinking of small fence posts, these are really tree trunks, right? And then so these posts here were shallower, and I think that's looking at the way that they're constructed and the orientation. There's no particular way in. There's no particular doorway into it. I don't think it's a closed structure in that sense, and I would interpret this as being a platform. Now, outside we have the eastern settings, and if you look at it, the shape has got a curved back, and it appears almost as though it's segmental coming down in here like this. And then we run into the outer enclosure around the side here. Now, looking at these post holes, and this becomes sort of important really, because they're basically, the post holes fall down into two forms. We have this type of post hole, of which there are relatively few positively identified. And here we have, if you imagine, you dig a hole for the post, you put the post in, and then you backfill it. And this is what we might call our primary fill. So in terms of this post hole, this is primary fill. And here we have fairly loose structure running down the center. And this, I think, is probably where the post has rotted in situ. And as it's rotted, it's pulled down some of the surface soil, which is rich in charcoal. But basically, there are sort of vesicles and sort of gaps down here. There were no stones running down here, and fairly soft. So it just takes all the character of something post that had rotted in situ. Now, you compare that to this, and this is one of the big 4-poster post holes. And these were 2.2 meters deep. This is a totally different look to it. Here we have our primary fill around the side here for the post, but the central part is full of stones, charcoal, scrapes of soil, and so on and so forth. And it looks almost as though there's a funnel that's been cut through. So this represents a secondary fill because the post has been extracted, the post has been taken out. We'll come to that later on as how that could have happened. And it's been backfilled with a mixture of charcoal and stones that run right down to the bottom. These are the two extremes of the post holes. And then you get various post holes sort of in between that, which look as though parts of them have been removed, parts of the post have been removed in some cases, and in other cases, they've bits have rotted off. So a complete mixture. But let's take a look at this one. This is one of the 4 posters in the middle of the Ballynahatty 6. And you can see as we go down, this is the surface here. Stones scattered around in a matrix of charcoaly soil. Go down just 30 centimeters and it begins to resolve itself into one post hole here, another one here, and another one here. Go down a meter, and clearly we begin to see 4 post holes, but again, with the stones following down into them. So it looks as though most of the post holes, most of the posts from this enclosure have been removed at some stage and backfilled. Oh, this is a view of the entrance. And this is upside down simply because this actually represents this side of the entrance. But there's a reasonable photograph to give you some idea of what they were like. Here we've got a double post hole here and a double post hole here. And this is part of the facade, right? And then this is the inner row running around the back here. And you can see people working on the platform on the interior, just at this point here. Also note the topsoil, a mass of very hard material sitting on top of basically sandy beds. So taking a look at these particular post holes, and these are the post holes of the outer ring, just putting them all in together. They look a bit variable because I say the problem was of actually trying to find the post holes at the top. We had to go down quite far to find some of them. But the characteristics of them are that all these profiles are radial profiles, so taken from the inside out, as it were. And this side, the left-hand side, is the exterior side. And you can see traces of ramps on a lot of these running down like this, and so on and so forth. Right, here are the ramps, the outer ramps. You can also see, because the lower part was sand, very soft sand, you can see where a post has been elevated, slid down the ramp, and is embedded in the far wall before it was then dragged upright. Again, you see the same sort of thing here. This has been eroded down by the end of the post, ramming in to the other side. And you can see it in 2 or 3. There's another example of the same thing happening there. Let's go back again. In some cases, in this one over here, there was a great gouge down the side. So clearly they lost control of the post as it was sliding down the ramp, and it hit the side before they dragged it upright. What it meant, because of the size of these post holes, and it was quite important, we got one person to test the digging of a post hole. It was actually Billy Dunlop, using an antler pick and a bucket, and he was charged with actually constructing one of these post holes and digging one of these post holes. So he dug down 2 meters just simply using an antler pick, and the size of the post hole really is determined by the size of the person, obviously, that's in it. And basically, the post hole is this size, because you've got to get into it, and an elbow room size as well. But you end up with something at the bottom which is fairly broad, so you can fine position the post once it goes in. You could drag it backwards and forwards to make certain it goes in precisely the position that you want it to go in. And that was quite crucial, I think. Now, just around this side here, something just slightly different happened. And here we are during the excavation. And you can see, again, how thick the overburden is here. And they had great difficulty getting through this. So they didn't dig individual post holes, but they dug from one side or the other, probably from this side, and they chipped away at it, and they just worked their way along, taking off the overburden. And once they got rid of that, they then dug down into the soft sand. That presented them with a bit of a difficulty in terms of once you put a post in and keeping it upright. So in between these areas, there were piles of stone. I think that was put in probably to help support and to separate out the individual post holes. So moving on to the outer enclosure, again, masses of post holes, and you can see from ranging rods, they're 2-meter ranging rods, the depth of these posts, the post holes, and just taking a linear run down the posts, we can see that they're actually sloping down to the north. We're on the north end here, slightly downslope, but they're running more or less together. Some of them have run in together as double post holes. But there's also this other line, which we call the north-south line, which is these posts running down this side here. And I thought possibly that they were going to go all the way around the enclosure, but they don't. I think they just stop where we see them there. And they mirror later series of posts which were put round the outside of this annex, the later annex. And you could probably interpret those maybe as sort of, maybe like miniature totem poles or something like that, freestanding posts. Whereas these are all more or less paired posts and reflecting the construction of the inner enclosure as well. So if we move on to looking at what we call the annex, and you can see this is actually the entrance through, which is this part here, and it's slightly splayed at this point here. But also there are some odd things happening. Although it was slightly splayed, there was a line of posts put in here, which were later. This is the line of the entrance chamber, and the entrance chamber has been inserted later as well. And what we can see here, in fact, is the effect of putting in the entrance chamber and then joining up the original entrance with it. Now, we move over to look at the facade, call it the grand facade, because it was, I think, very, very impressive. What we're looking at here is the secondary fill, right? So imagine the posts that were put in have been taken out. And in fact, there are three lines of posts in this facade. This is one line. Then underneath this lot is another line. And then you have the massive later facade being put in here. So that corresponds to the inner line, then a middle line, which was largely destroyed by when the outer line was taken out. So the massive facade that we see was removed, and then stone fill was then put into it. So we've got a whole lot of stone, almost like a stone spine being put in here. But the original posts ran down right to the bottom of this. But a lot of this is just the pit that was dug in order to extract those posts. So this is looking at it from the other direction, and you can see the depth of the spine. This is it, looking at the northern section of the facade, more or less when this section had been finished excavation. We didn't excavate fully the southern end of it. We just took it down until we could make certain that there were posts there. And in fact, it's a mirror image really of what's going on here. So the pairing of these posts were down at the bottom here and this section here. And we just picked up a few of them at the bottom. But basically, extracting these posts made a massive amount of damage. So when we got to the bottom, these are the remains of the posts. And a setting of stones, some of them have been taken out, but the stones around the outside really delineated the thickness of the post at the bottom. Right? So we're looking at, you can see, around about 1 meter. So these are massive posts that were being put in here. And you just think about cutting that lot down with stone axes. So you've got to remove, got to cut down these effectively massive trees, mature trees, got to lop off the branches, drag them to the site and erect it. But some of them actually showed a sort of hump in the middle. So I think the possibility is that some of these posts that we were bringing in had heart rot. So all the pressure was going down on the outside and leaving a sort of hump in the middle. And they may have indeed have chosen some of the trees because of that. But if you tap the tree, It sounds a little bit hollow. It's less of a problem to cut down a tree like that. And this is during the excavation, and there's Ken and the team. Ken made these elaborate bits of instrumentation in order to create, draw profiles and so on in a really quite a difficult area. So, in terms of producing the drawing of this, the plans and the sections, the problem is before we actually dug down into this, we didn't really know what was underneath it. So we put in arbitrary box sections. And so it wasn't really until we got to the bottom that we found that the bottoms of the post holes. So therefore, all our sections, or I should say really none of our sections actually went nicely across where the posts would have been. They're all bits and pieces. So, but nevertheless, this clips with the edge of one of the post holes. And here is just a model of backfill of secondary fill, and again the similar thing here, backfill the secondary fill, and here again got a bit of a problem. Probably more of the middle facade post in that position, and this is a view actually at the bottom, and you see where the posts actually sat, and these are the middle facade posts running along here. See another one just there. So look at the entrance chamber. The entrance chamber is probably the last thing that went in, one of the last things that went in, and it was fitted into the annex. And we can see that really in two ways, or three ways really. I've already just mentioned that in order for this to connect up with the original entrance, extra posts were put in just along here to fit. Also, although it's square, it slightly tapers in here because it has to fit in within the line of this facade post down here. So it's been squashed to fit in there. Also over on this side, remember this is where the outer enclosure runs along here. They actually took down one post. I think they cut it down and they put in the corner post of the entrance chamber just beyond it. So it didn't actually replace it, but they had to move that over in order to make it square. Now within it, there are 4 posts, just as there are 4 posts within what we would call the square and circle enclosure, the inner enclosure. But whereas the inner enclosure was a termination, this is not. This is a pausing point, if you like, because we got an entrance through here and we have an exit from this side and an entry into the larger enclosure. So this 4 posters here is like a square pulled apart, and they made to fit quite nicely into each of these sides. So a quick look at the artifacts. So in terms of the lithic artifacts, we can see that we've got a variety of things. We've got scrapers, there are a few hollow scrapers, we've got a few projectile points, some knives, a lot of miscellaneous material, some elements with an edge retouch. There's some core tools, there's some axe fragments, and so on. But most of it, what we see, are scrapers. But if you notice down this side, that we have a percentage of these are actually burnt, right? So some are whole, but a lot of it is burnt. And a lot of the debitage, which is not really mentioned here, a lot of the debitage, of which we had hundreds of pieces of debitage, a lot of that was actually burnt as well. But here's a rough proportion down at the bottom here of the tool assemblage. And you see that scrapers form most of what we actually got. In terms of the distribution, on this side, we can look at really what was coming up in the topsoil. Remember, the top part of our site had been largely destroyed through ploughing and cultivation and so on and so forth. So a lot of what would have been visible on the site, if it was a virgin site, has got mixed up in the topsoil. So we can see that there's more of a concentration of lithic material in this area. So this is the area of the annex, especially of the northern side of the annex as well. And when we look at the distribution actually within postholes, most of it is coming from either the inner enclosure, Ballynahatty 6, or the entrance chamber, and also the eastern settings. And from this, simply, what you can take from this is that if you look at the grey area, this is the material that came from the secondary fill, right? Whereas the brown represents lithics in the primary fill. So virtually all the material, all the lithics that we get is coming from the secondary fill. That's after much of the posts were taken out and the material was being backfilled. And this just sort of shows you there, here we are, the four lithics from the four-poster, the inner enclosure, Ballynahatty 6, and the entrance chamber, and you can see the numbers vastly outweigh. If we actually look at where we see these, the numbers, it actually becomes quite interesting because there isn't an even distribution. You might think that, okay, we're picking up this material in the secondary fills, that it would be a fairly even spread all over, but in fact it isn't at all. So if you look at the entrance, there are 205 pieces from one side, 153 from the other. Here, one of the four posters has got 300 pieces of flint, 101 pieces there, 30 pieces or 70 pieces here, 18 pieces here. And most of the flint is coming from this side here. And if you look at the entrance chamber, most of it is coming from the south side and from the south side in terms of the four posters as well. So there seems to be a draw to the south. And then remember that the south side of the excavation, this is the side that really is the side of the passage tomb and the side of the Giant's Ring henge. Some of the other artifacts that were found a couple of stone balls, whether we think of these as being stone balls themselves or whether they are simply hammerstones, they're actually quite difficult to tell, but they were quite distinctive in terms of what we found. We found fragments of axes, polished stone axes, and two further axes. What is remarkable, in fact, is if you think of the sheer amount of wood that went into the site, 450 or so posts went in here, and we really got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 traces of 5 axes. One might expect to have a lot more. This seems to be a lignite bead. It's quite sizable. And you can see the perforation from either side. So hourglass perforations from either side. And originally, this probably would have been polished and would have looked in sort of a deep polished black color. Pottery, the pottery that comes from the timber enclosure is really all grooved ware, typically flat-bottomed grooved ware with variety of groove, 1 groove, 4 grooves, 3 grooves, and even no grooves, groove ware, but typically flat-bottomed. What we can see from this, in fact, this is looking at the interior of some of the of 3 shards of the grooveware pottery, is that in fact it has been used. There's traces of what is food, actually I think probably fatty substances. So this is pottery which has actually been used. If you contrast that with the pottery from the passage tombs, that pottery hadn't been used. That was made specifically for the cremations. This is used pottery. Distribution of the pots, well, a little bit coming up around in here, but most of it is coming up in the this section of the annex and of the entrance chamber, and a few bits and pieces around here. Whether that you consider this pottery to be ritually placed pottery, is another thing entirely. A lot of pottery was being scattered around within this area, but whether the post holes were dug through areas where there was pottery on the surface and then got incorporated, or whether it was put in specifically, is actually difficult to say. But probably some of it was being placed specifically in the post holes, especially when we look at this run round here. Just as we found evidence of early Neolithic pottery scattered through the topsoil, so we found traces of Bronze Age pottery, and in this case, a bit of a collared urn, and also a little bit of a vast food vessel. So this witnesses the fact that after the site was finished, there was continuous occupation. And remember, those ring ditches we could see on the aerial photographs probably relate to Bronze Age occupation. So dating. Goodness sake, don't ask me what this means. Rowan McLaughlin did an excellent job of analysing the dates. And the important thing, I think, is if we look at what's happening down here, the initial burial phase, so that would be the passage tomb type of burials. We're coming in at around about 3,400 to 3,000 BC. We saw those dates earlier on. There then seems to be this hiatus of activity where nothing really much seems to be happening. And then we have the construction of the timber circles. And this seems to be started around about 2,700 BC and the later end of the Neolithic. And then stretching into the remodeling that went on of the annex, the later remodeling. And that is happening around about 2,650 round to around about 2,500 BC. And interestingly enough, he puts this down into thinking about it as probably 4 generations. So the first generation built it, the last generation saw the end of it. So even the people at the end probably would have had a memory passed down or whatever of when the thing was constructed. Just looking down here at these curves, this shows the intensity of the use of the radiocarbon dates. Compare that to other timber circles that have been found in Ireland, coming out to approximately the same date. The burials come in earlier. These are the passage tomb style burials coming in up here, and megalithic sites in general have a peak at this time. So there's a lot of activity happening at the end of the Neolithic period, and our site fits into that of other timber circles. Just to get a background on the vegetation history as well. So here we are about in the middle of the Ballynahatty field, the middle of the cemetery, looking north, and also we can see right in the distance there's Cave Hill over there. We can just see Belfast Lock along there, right down to Whitehead at the end. Here's Belfast. We're just about there. And the River Lagan flows through here like this, running through. But look at this area here, this, which we'll simply call Ballynahatty Bog. It is a boggy area. All along one side, we can see little bits of masonry coming up because a cottage that was in this side here on the Terrace Hill, they wanted to get rid of it and they thought they'd fill it in, so they put it in this side and it just sank without trace, virtually without trace. But this side is still, shall we say, relatively untouched. And Jill Plunkett has done an analysis of the pollen from the pollen mounds that came through here. So it turned out that this is a glacial cattle lake. There's a sort of a mound at one side and this hollow, which became infilled with water and shows a vegetation history really from the late glacial period onwards. So it's really quite interesting, beyond simply what was happening at the for the archaeological sites. And so we can run around right from the post-glacial period, as what one would expect, start off with wet woodland, grasses, sedges, and so on, around about 9,000 BC. First broadleaf appears, especially hazel and poplar. By 7,000 BC, we've got hazel scrub, more oak pollen, some pine coming in at this point. And then 6,500 to 6,000 BC, you see a change, more or less at the Mesolithic period. And there is one Mesolithic axe that was found down at Edenderry, so we know there was a Mesolithic occupation, might be the stronger word for it, but Mesolithic peoples were in the area at various times. So therefore, we get a drier and cooler period, followed about 500,000 years later by a spread of alder and heathland plants. But then in the Neolithic period, coming in sometime after 4,500, we see aquatic pollen in the zone, actually within the bog. So it's open water now. We see an opening of the woodland, and we see plantain coming in, ribwood plantain and charcoal, which suggests clearance. An increase in oak and alder. By 4,000 BC, a further opening of the woodland, and we see the first sign of cereal pollen. So from 4,000 on, that's when we expect possibly that passage to have been constructed. By the middle Neolithic period, we've got clear signs of arable cultivation, cereal pollen, 3,600. Moving on, by 3,450, that becomes more sporadic, and cultivation maybe is more patchy, what's going on, and there's more grassland appearing. Then the late Neolithic period maybe of our timber enclosures, of the henge. Here we can see a clear decline in cultivation and an increase in oak woodland. And by 2,500, woodland regeneration. So it looks as though any occupation, and if there was clearance of over the area of the cemetery, maybe that was beginning to grow back again. Then we hit the early Bronze Age, and we see an increase in land use. After that, the peat was too liquid to be able to be used, but we've got a good sequence there. Okay. The construction and use of the timber enclosures, I think, really sort of focus really on the quality of the work that was being done in the prehistoric period. And I would like to think that, whereas when we look at a lot of prehistoric sites, we see them a little bit as though, a fly-by-night builder had been working on them. Things are not particularly regular, they're a bit haphazard. They may be conforming to a sort of shape, but there are all sorts of local variations and so on and so forth. Here, everything was done with such precision and with planning. Sites have to have been planned. And I hope to convince you that really we can really think in terms of maybe a Neolithic architect at work here. So let's look at the inner enclosure of Ballynahatty 6. And think how that was actually physically laid out and constructed. Because you can see from this that just put the post holes in, but we can use a series of circles, and everything falls neatly in place on a series of concentric circles. And those concentric circles are equally distant. And the distance between those circles is the same as the distance between the posts themselves. So they're using a standard unit of measurement. And you can imagine the way that this was done simply by using a stake rammed into the center, a length of rope, and another stake. And you draw around in the soil a series of concentric circles which mark out where you're going to put the various posts. And then maybe you use stakes to ram in to show where they're going to go. So the inner circle, A1, that shows you where square enclosure, which I think is the platform, goes just in here. We can miss a beat, and then the next one, we've got the 4 posters coming in. And the next line, we've got the inner line, the inner enclosure here. we miss a beat, but there was a cremation just at that point on there. And we've got another line of posts running out around here. And then we go again for another line in the concentric circles to here, to this point. And at this point, there is a pit with split stones in it. Nothing else, just split stones. There's no burials, no cremations, a pit with split stones. But the curious thing is, it's directly on the axis that runs through here, like this. Now, we talked about the facade, a flattened facade on the outside here. But if you use this pit here with the split stones in it, and use that as the origin, and then draw another arc round here, that facade fits perfectly onto it. You then take a line running out, it's like an axial line running through here, and select another point, point B. And if you then draw another arc from C through B and running out to the edge here of another constructed circle, which is the same size as this one, we come to this point. And you can do the same with the arc running round to this point. Project that line through the center of point B, out to the other side, you get the other end of this arc. So you can see how this section was constructed as well. And you can see why this, in fact, is a segmental construction. And you can also see the crucial point here, one of the most crucial points possibly in the whole structure, is this point B. Because it's from here, this specific point, this very point, a dot in the ground, if you like, that you can see all the way into the interior here. Come back further from here, you can't see all of the interior. You can only see the interior from this point, and back down, see the interior from that point. Also, looking forwards, it's the first point at which you see through the opening the full extent of the platform. So from that one point, you see three things happening. Very, very important. Also notice that here we have the outer enclosure, the annex, and the entrance to the entrance through the outer enclosure falls directly on this construction line as well. So the whole thing has been perfectly planned out. How do we start interpreting these posts that run around here? Because remember, we've got a double line paired posts running through here of the outer enclosure, got paired posts running around here of the inner enclosure as well. So the question really is, how would we interpret that? And this is an early drawing trying to just work things out. So here we have a facade, because I think we have a plank facade. So, and this is the flattened facade. So I think that's perfectly reasonable that that part was planked. Were they just a series of posts so you could walk through them in any direction? Right? They're just standing there. There's no barrier at all. Well, they could have been, I suppose. I don't know why you would want two lines, but they could perfectly well have been two specific lines of posts. In order, if that was the case, you would have had to have probably lintels or something around the top, because otherwise they're just a massive posts. So the whole organization just doesn't fit. Could they have been a simple barrier, wattle and wattle or something like that? Why have massive posts and just fit wattle to them? Why put something in that's just going to last for 100 years and then put in wattle which will last for 5? That doesn't make sense at all. So these rather random images taken from the internet, this is what I think was happening. We have uprights and we have the infill. And this is an elegant way of dealing with it. We have a series of infills, which are basically the aerial parts of the trees that you cut down. And it seemed to work, and it's particularly dense in nature. So in terms of the Ballynahatty structure, I think it may have looked something like this. Very, very tall, full of masses of branches, but fairly impenetrable. So how can we put that together? So Robert Barrett has worked on this and looking at the size of the post holes, the depth of the post holes, to look at something in the nature of the structure. And we know the order in which things were constructed. We know the sequence. We don't necessarily know the dating within the sequence. It's a bit more difficult. But this is our first phase, and we see that the Ballynahatty 6, that's when that's constructed. We then have the outer enclosure running around it. And the entrance is generally to the southeast, doesn't really fit onto anything in particular, doesn't seem to align with a rising sun or anything like this. It's just a general southeasterly direction, which is common to most of these timber circles. And so you could approach it really from anywhere. And we put in sort of pathways coming from various directions, because there's no specific route to go in. There's nothing to guide you in, if you like. We then have a rearrangement of the entranceway, and we now have the entrance through the ridge and along the ridgeway. This becomes very, very important. It's now become very, very specific, and you're not meant to approach this in any other way other than along that ridge from the east. And then, like in the final phase, we have the entrance chamber, and we have structures built along here and along here. And we've got another pairing of posts along here. So I think another wall has been put in here. And you can think of these as walls, not just fences, but these are walls, timber walls, with an outer line of posts. Again, are these some form of totem pole or something like that? And these massive posts are part of the same thing. And then there's another line which runs down the outside here. So the whole of this structure has been outlined by these separate posts. So this in its final phase is probably, I think, what it looks like. From the side, maybe just go back to look at that one. Look at the side here. This structure, what is the point of that structure? It doesn't really articulate with the side here. But when we look from the bottom of the slope and look up, what was a large enclosure, Ballynahatty 5, plus an annex, an entrance stuck on the outside, now becomes one cohesive structure. It appears to be virtually twice the size of what it actually is, simply by putting that line of post, that wall in there. And we're looking directly along the line here of the facade. And as we walk around it, we're at the bottom of the slope, we begin to see the main facade itself until we get round to the facade proper. And we're at the bottom of the slope, looking up now, massive facade. See the first of the 4 posters beyond it. We saw a whole mass of the Ballynahatty 5 enclosure running off to one side. And you can imagine how our architect, if you like, standing at the bottom of the slope, can look up and look at this, what in Neolithic terms would be a magnificent structure, terribly impressive, meant to impress. But there's a problem, and he probably thinks, damn it, it's off-center. That great facade is not centrally placed. It doesn't look right. So what can you do about that? Well, he thought about it, and if we look at the structure again, there are a line of 6 posts running down here. So how could those 6 posts make a difference? Because for a start, there's a difference in plane between this lot here and all this lot round here. And there are 40 posts in view there, and there are 6 posts in view on this side. But actually, when you look now at what those 6 posts do, that the position is exactly correct from that side to that side. It's perfectly centrally in place. So they've really thought about everything here in terms of making this impressive. But there's one more trick up our architect's sleeve. If you look at the last 2 posts on this side, they're closer together. Why would they be closer together? Remember, this is a straight line of posts. Well, he's fooling us again, because he's making us think that it's actually curving round. Although it's a straight line, it actually looks now as though it's curving round to match the curve on the other side. Very, very simple, just done with 6 posts. I think that's brilliant work. If we go upslope now, and I think, bearing in mind what this is, I think we're dealing with a mortuary structure here. So maybe we're carrying a corpse up into this structure. Here we are actually at the entrance. And what you see, the way that everything's arranged, you can look through. There may have been a gate there originally, but you look through as you walk in. And what you see nothing but the far end of the enclosure. You don't see the BNH 6 area. You don't see the eastern settings. The viewpoint runs straight between all of them. So if we go in, and we're now standing in the middle of the entrance chamber, and these 2 posts, that one there and that one there, that's the western side of our big 4 posters sitting there. We look through and we still can't really see what's going on inside. But I think this is a point, it must have been an important point, because there are these 4 posts. But this is a point where things are paused. You stop here. Maybe you're carrying your corpse on a bier, you set the corpse down there. And what you do, well, you go and have a wake. And I think if we go to the right side as you see it, we go, also, before we do that, also bear in mind, if we look up, right, all we're seeing is the sky. Everything is very enclosed. So the great focus really is on the sky. And that I think is actually important. But we go into the north side of the annex, and we've got that plank because it must have been blocked in some way. But there also must have been a door through the entrance chamber to get into the annex. But in the annex, I think that's where feasting took place. We found abundant signs of burning of hearths. This is where a lot of the pottery came out, pottery that had been used. A lot of the flint work came from this area as well. So it's an area, I think, which must be regarded as being for feasting. Possibly also construction of tools, because tools were being made here. Were tools made, flint tools made, in order or as part of the feasting process? Did you make your tools? Did you bring in an animal and slaughter it? Was this all part and parcel of it? When you finished, was everything then thrown on the fire? Is that why we have so much burnt flint material? Okay, so you've had your fill, and maybe, and I suspect that not everybody was allowed into the next part, but if you move then into the interior, and our figures are appropriately wooden here, but it gives you an idea. If you move into the interior, we are now standing close to that important crossover point, that point B. And now you can see the inner enclosure, and you can see the eastern settings. So is this what was happening? The corpse bring, or maybe you gave the corpse to somebody else to take in, shamans or whatever you like to call them, the equivalent of the priests who are looking after the place. But if you move to that central point, that point B, this, as I say, is where you can look in to these cubicles, which I think maybe they were ossuaries. This is possibly where the bones were placed. Look you look into them and you can see the whole of what's inside there. And you look round to look straight ahead where our figure is. And from this point, you can see what's happening inside the inner enclosure. When you get into the inner enclosure, and I would imagine that only very few people will be allowed to go into this enclosure. I think that point, that crucial point, is where most people will have stopped. And when you're in the enclosure, again, the focus is on the sky. And I think the platform is probably an exposure platform. It's for excarnation. This is where the corpse has been brought, maybe piles of corpses there. And the idea is that wind, weather, time, carrion birds, rats, if they could get up there, would remove the flesh. And what you'd be left with after a while are the bones, clean bones. And these bones maybe would have, or certain parts of the bones would have been placed in those cubicles on the way in, those ossuaries. And when you look down it from above, you realize just how enclosed this is. I mean, that platform couldn't be used really, I don't think, for talking to a load of people as a platform to stand on. It's very much of an enclosed place. So what happened at the end of it? Well, we talked about before, our sections show that we got a secondary deposit that posts were extracted. Because I think the whole superstructure was burnt down, it was ritually burnt down. I think it's fair to say that it was cremated. One didn't just set fire to it, well, that's it. Why did they do it? And I think the clue is in looking at those other post holes, where some posts had rotted in situ. Other posts were taken out. Some posts were in too poor condition. When they tried to pull it out, just the butt just stayed in there and wouldn't come out. It was rotten. But where they could, they took out the posts. This is the line of posts on the northern annex. And you look over here, this is during excavation, and we've just managed to delineate where the post holes were. What you're seeing in here is the primary fill, okay, when the post was put in, initially backfilled. And what you're seeing here is where the post has been taken out and a secondary fill of stones has been put in. And look, all of these have got stone fills. In section, this is what they look like. Masses of charcoal plus stones. When we look at the section, masses of stones plus charcoal. So I think you see this as being like a ritual death of the temple, but they were preserving it. They weren't just taking it out and leaving it. The posts themselves must have been really important in order to do this. Having extracted the butts, what would they done? I presume those were burnt as well. So the actual temple itself, if we call it that, had a life of its own, and it had a death of its own. It was cremated, and then they created a skeleton, permanent skeleton in the ground using all these stones. So, is that possible? Can you extract posts? Well, that bell-shaped pit showed that they dug a bell-shaped pit, moved the timber post around to take it out. The smaller posts, or some of the other posts, I think were taken straight out. And so we did an experiment to see, could this be done? And there's our very own Billy Dunlop. He that dug the 2-meter deep post hole. It took him 25 hours. We then found a telegraph pole, a short piece of telegraph pole. We put it in, and Billy backfilled it, rammed the soil down as much as possible. And then we thought, well, it's buried 2 meters down. Can we just take it straight out of the ground again? Now, admittedly, it hadn't been in the ground for 50 or 100 years, but nevertheless, it was could see if we could do it. So simply using 2 pieces of timber, a coil of rope running round, and 2 stones to act as fulcrums. But then just like moving a cork from a wine bottle, lift them up, push them down, the rope tightened firmly on the post, and the post came up just slightly, just a few centimeters. Just by leaning against the post, you could stop it falling down. So you lift the two levers up again, drop them down, and do the same sort of thing. And you keep doing that, and the post gradually came up out of the ground. And you can see what's happening here. The post has reached the top. And one of the important things here is look at the mess it's creating. And this is one reason why we had so much difficulty looking at our post holes and finding our post holes, because originally there was a complete mess going on around the bottom. And you also remember that the place would have been ash everywhere, bits of wood, embers, all sorts of things happening all around the place. People paddling around in this stuff, a complete mess over the surface. We then put a 2-meter post ranging rod down to make certain it did go down, and then started dropping stones down. That's me simply to show you I was there, dropping stones down. Well, it was a long series of excavations. I'd like to put a picture of everybody in there, but I couldn't. So this is just the last season. And what you see on the right side is the final season, which was actually February 2000, with the last 3 people standing, as it were, still working at the site. And as Anne said, there's an excellent book about this. And I'm going to finish by quoting the book, just to try and summarize things. How then should we describe the BNH5 and BNH6 enclosures? Timber enclosure is a bland expression of a defined space and gives no indication of function. The care, precision, and public effort of the build displays high status. The development of the grand facade and the position on the ridge shows that this was meant to impress and possibly to intimidate. The control of access, the choreographing of movement without and within, and the careful organization of space show that this was a structure built for predetermined rituals. The placement within a known mortuary landscape and the link to the earlier passage tomb indicate that this is about the management of death and the referencing of an ancestral past. Although we cannot say for certain, this probably functioned in whole or in part as an excavation site. Without further excavation, what happened in the larger enclosure remains a mystery, but is a precinct set apart from the outside world. The organization of Ballynahatty 6 and the eastern settings gives a rare opportunity to witness a specific point at which ritual observance clearly happened. The soils of Ballynahatty do not preserve bone, unless it's burnt, of course, and inhumation in soil would not be recognized. So maybe the term mortuary house is not appropriate, in which a body is buried. Charnel house, which encompasses excarnation, exhumation, cremation and storage of human skeletons, would certainly be an apt description. But what actually happened at that crucial point between the eastern settings? Was this a glimpse of eternity? Communing with the ancestors and making offerings? Was this the point beyond which a priestly caste or equivalent could walk? A point where the simple observance of the natural order as a human body decays becomes a journey from death back to life, but in a world of ancestors. Experiences such as these constitute a system of religious belief and ordered ritual tied to a specific building. So perhaps BNH6 is more than simply a warehouse for the dead or a shrine for the ancestors, but is also a temple for the living. Thank you very much indeed. I've gone on for very long, sorry about that.
Barrie, thank you so much indeed. I'm sure everybody will agree that that was a magnificent talk, and how you managed to squeeze sort of 10 years of excavations into an hour and a half, I really don't know. But before we sort of finish off our formal thank yous, perhaps you'd be willing to take a few questions?
Certainly, yes, yes. If you wait that long, yes.
Right. Anybody?
Confounded.
Yes.
At the start, one of the maps of the overall site showed little dots all over the site. Is that where you found flits, or there were?
Those are on the when we're looking at the cemetery. That map.
Yes.
Yes.
The cemetery. How did you know it was a cemetery?
If you remember on some of the slides, I pointed out that in fact there's a great overburden, sort of stone overburden, which is very, very hard, and there's sort of sand underneath it. And it's partly a glacial process compacting the surface. Very hard to get through that. What the crop marks, the darker marks are shown, is where that hard, indurate surface has been perforated, has been dug through into the sand below. So what it allows is that when a crop is growing on under certain conditions of drought and so on, when the rest of the crop starts to mature off and gets effectively dies and gets a sort of light color, the crop growing over these perforations, if you like, is still able to suck up water and therefore stays greener longer, and that gives the dark dots. But what it means, the implication of that, is that the surface has been perforated down. Now that indurate layer can be anything from about 15 centimeters to 40, 50 centimeters. So it means something serious has actually dug down through it. And from my point of view, and because historically there are lots of references to small burials, that small kiss burials and the like, being found throughout those fields. So I think I put on a representative number of dots, but there could have been about another 100 more, which I didn't put in. They were unproven, but I think probably they represent part of the cemetery.
My question's exactly the same.
Yeah. We need.
Did you get a chance to test it?
No. But I felt I couldn't not put those dots in. I felt I had to put in a representative shot just to show what was really what I think was happening through there. Because as I said, we know that there were a whole series of burials. We know from the article in 1855 there were a whole series of burials, small kiss and things like this being found. Also at that time, they talked about cartloads of human bones being removed from the area. Yeah? So a lot was going on in there, of which we just, the aerial photograph just indicate part and parcel of it.
You didn't mention any precedents as regards similar sites in Europe. Are there any? And did you pay the farmer rental for the use of the field?
Well, there are, I mean, beyond Europe, I mean, there are a number of timber enclosures certainly throughout the British Isles, and there are a number, there are at least 20 or so in Ireland, but nothing is quite as elaborate as this, apart from one, which is in the Boyne, and that is, and I didn't show a picture of it, but it is exactly the same plan, the B&H6, the inner enclosure, exactly the same plan, but exactly twice the size. So there is, if I can present, there is something else happening down there as well. The second part of your question is, yes, I, Queen's, paid the farmer a regular amount, and my plea every year was for him not to backfill it. He was paid to backfill it, but I asked him not to, and we were able to keep large areas of the site open. Eventually, we had to start backfilling bits and pieces. No, the whole site wasn't open at any one time. Only parts of the site was open through time, right? And then in the final year, or after we finished, I gave him another tranche of money and said, now you can backfill it, and you can take the massive spoil heap that we'd accumulated and you can put it back in. And he had a JCB, and I thought this was perfect. He could use his JCB because he loved machines. He could use his JCB to push that back. In the end, he decided he wasn't going to do that. He ordered a big HIMAC, and he backfilled it and then took out all the field boundaries all through the whole area. And all our fixed points were actually on the field boundaries. So they all went at the same time. So he could use it for his combine harvester moving backwards and forwards. So yes, he was paid. And we got along very well with the farmer, Jim Thompson. Sadly, he died a few years back. But yes, and even when he was driving his combine harvester, he once stopped it, got down and picked up a piece of flint and brought it over to me and asked if that wasn't, but you know, I mean, the mere fact that he was looking for pieces of flint while he's driving his combine harvester, I thought was quite remarkable.
I'm no academic, okay? I know probably less than anybody else here, but the posts on the facade were massive. They looked like massive, anyway. And the photograph suggested they were in sections, but would they have been brought as a single unit from wherever they were cut down? And if so, when it came to raising them, was there a specific technique?
Yes, I mean, most of the posts were oak, right? So call them posts, they're trees, really. A lot of the oak trees, I mean, there wouldn't have been like field oaks, which branch from lower down. You know, if they're in a compact area, they would grow long and straight, and they would easily grow 8, 9, 10 meters before they branched, right? So you're going to get long, straight poles. So I think they would have been cut down using stone axes. They've been cut down on site from the area around about. They may have been further up the Lagan Valley because they needed something in order of something, I think, nearly 500 posts, you know, of massive posts. So it's really quite a lot. That would strip a large area. Some of the posts may have been floated down the river, for all we know, and then they would have to be dragged up on site. But they would have been, excuse me, the posts would have been, the branches must have been cut off in order to be able to get them, to be able to bring them on site. But then the toppings and so on, which I think created the wall, that would have been brought in at some stage. They could have been dragged in from anywhere, really, just to top up. And that sort of thing would have probably after 10, 15, 20 years, it would start to compact down, and they would just cut off more branches and just fill it back up again, you know, to preserve it.
Two points. One, it showed as if they were cut long planks, but they wouldn't have been.
Oh, yes. Yes, because, I mean, we talk about sort of stone axes, but some axes were probably used rather more to split stones with. You would have put them in the inside of the wood, if you like, and hammered them in and created a split. And in so doing, you can more end up with radial planks, you know, that would have been split down from a tree trunk. So that's perfectly possible. I mean, all the time. I mean, these were woodworkers par excellence, really. Even though they were using simply stone axes, a whole variety of different stone axes that you can use, of course. But they were using those stone axes. I mean, they was used axes to make dugout canoes and all sorts of things like that. So all this sort of thing is perfectly possible. Yeah.
The second point is I'm feeling very, very guilty. It was 30 years ago when you just started the site. I was doing Larry Dunlop's big garden, but you showed in the, you know, the adjacent place. I wasn't looking out for flints.
Did you come across in your research any similar configurations in Europe or in England? Or is this purely an Irish habit?
It's the whole complex is actually quite unique, I think. I mean, we find large enclosures. They're all through England as well. And we find what we might call them square and circle, the 4 posts in a circle. You find those, fairly readily. But as a complex, it does seem to be quite unique, and it's really very much focused. The development of it is focused on what was happening actually in the Ballynahatty landscape. And the whole point of changing that entry point, for example, was to bring people upslope on the end of that ridge. And that became very important. So they were manipulating the way people walked through the landscape, right? From below, I think. There were certain areas at which you'd actually climb up onto the plateau, and you'd enter the structure in a specific way. So you experienced it in a specific way. So it's very much sort of site specific, if you like, how it was developed. In other areas, things may be developed in a different way. I don't know.
Thank you.
Barrie, go ahead.
I just wanted to know a minor detail, but the translation of Ballynahatty, what is there a connection?
Ballynahatty, no, I think it just means site of a house or something like that. I don't think it's anything that would specifically. I mean, the terminology of house may refer to the Giant's Ring. I don't know. The Giant's Ring was originally called the Giant's Den.
But the Haggy, what Haggy?
Ballynahatty. Hattie. I don't think there's anything specific that would really point to an origin here.
Yeah.
It isn't like Navan really, where there's a great mythology based on the area. There's really nothing other than calling it the Giant's Ring or the Giant's Den. Other than that, no.
If you Google that, you might get lucky.
You may get lucky.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Brian, when there's obviously a great bit of detective work there and interpretation, like, and really makes us think about the skills of the architect that the people that developed this thing. But the burials there have been very much for an elite group, wouldn't they? A ceremonial type of thing. Does it all point towards that? I mean, I know there were other people buried around various cemeteries and stuff, but that enclosure there would have been for.
We don't know. See, there's no excavation in the larger enclosure. Don't know what went on in there. And indeed, if it's been used for over 100 years, things may have changed. The rituals may have changed during that time. They may have developed. So we don't know whether this is where everybody was processed, or whether excarnation was universal, or whether a certain amount of cremation, or whether there was excarnation and cremation. There are so many different permutations of things that could happen, and even if you take that earlier tomb, the 1855 tomb, which has got cremations and then disarticulated bone of them brought in, was that disarticulated bone, although it's earlier than our enclosure here, was that disarticulated bone simply bone that had been lifted out of stone chambers or something like that? Or was that actually a process of excarnation in itself? And we know that there are examples from around about 3000 BC where bodies were, or flesh was being actually stripped from a corpse. You can see cut marks on the bone where this was clearly being done. So that was part and parcel of the process. And I think it becomes very important, as if you think about this, that the whole point about things like excarnation is that it's a change from something or somebody that is recognizable to somebody that isn't, right? You're becoming, if you like, from the known to the unknown. You're creating an anonymous society, if you like, a society of ancestors. You can't recognize skulls and things like that. You can't recognize the facial features. It's only when people are alive, freshly dead, that you can actually recognize a specific person. But as soon as the flesh goes, you can't recognize anybody. So therefore, it's a move, I think, into a world of ancestors. And that's what this is all about. It's a transition, if you like, into the world of ancestors. And it could have been that everybody went through this process. Maybe it was elite. It's a big thing, big structure, really, simply for the elite. But, it could very well be.
Was there ever a giant? And what was his name?
It would be nice, wouldn't it? But no, I don't. Not as far as we haven't found one. We never actually found the giant. But I think the giant really is specific to the size of the ring. Yeah.
What's the interpretation of Nahatty? Bally is simple, but what does Nahatty mean?
Yeah, no, I think it's my understanding it was something to do with the house, the place of the house, or something like that. Simply that. That's something we can look into. Yep. Could be. Could be. That would be appropriate, wouldn't it? It would make sense. Yeah.
House in the white.
We have a couple questions online, but someone did comment, Sean McGrath said that Ballynahatty in Irish means townland of the house site.
Town of the house site. Okay, right.
The first question is, where did the non-erratic stones come from?
They're all basalt, as far as I'm aware. So they've come from the Antrim Plateau. They say the whole area has been glaciated, so they've been plucked out of the Antrim Plateau.
The second question is, are there any plans for further excavations at Ballynahatty?
Not by me, I'm retired. I'm not going for another 10 years. As you see, I mean, it is such an intensive area. There's so many questions come from here. We haven't really considered the Giant's Ring. How old is the Giant's Ring henge? Nobody knows. Henges generally are badly dated. So we need to do some work on the henge and what's inside the henge. That requires a big excavation. We don't know anything about the larger enclosure of Ballynahatty 5. All that would be a major excavation. There are all those sites around all over the place. We don't know anything about those. They need to be really investigated, ground truthed, if you like. There's that curious thing that could be a cursus. Is it a cursus? That needs excavation. There are so many sites up there and there's so much work that needs to be done. Just need money to do it. Collection plate going around.
Well, just on that point, you know, given the now importance of the landscape compared to the Boyne and Stonehenge, is there any move to schedule the landscape?
Yes, the area has been scheduled out. Yes, it has been. Belatedly, you know, just what, 4 or 5 years ago. A lot happened in the intervening time and a lot of damage had been done by that stage, but it has been scheduled now, yes.
There's another question online. It is the timber complex actually contemporary with the henge or later?
Well, you see, that's the next lecture, really, because, and it's getting on very late, I don't know how to keep you. If you want to, in short, we don't know how old the henge is. There've been at least 3 excavations in there, and they all finished before 1954 and before radiocarbon dating. So we don't know. My guess is that when you've got the new entrance, the annex being constructed to bring people up the slope, right? That means that the entry point was right over on the eastern side of the plateau. Now, the Giant's Ring entrance, what we presume is the entrance, is right up against the eastern side, the eastern edge of the plateau. And the entry point to the Giant's Ring and what would have been the entry or the exit point of downslope from the timber structure, from our temple, is about 100 meters away from one another. My guess is that the Giant's Ring was constructed when they reorientated the entranceway, and that we should really consider this to be one massive site. The henge, the really important and very old passage tomb, that everything is focused around because the henge is built around, specifically around the passage tomb, right? So we've got a sequence of constructions here. So I think if you went back to round about 2600 BC, this would be a massively orchestrated, organized ritual area and ritual zone with the timber structure up on its ridge, maybe the focus on the sky, and then down below you have the henge, maybe with the passage tube and the notion of it going into the passage tube and therefore going down into the ground. So maybe there's a sort of duality going on here, the sky and the earth. I don't know. It's pure speculation, you know. But I think that is where the two of them would come. Now, could be completely wrong there, and it may be. I think almost certainly, probably that the henge is later. But I think that it's the construction of the henge would equate with the final phase of the timber enclosure. My guess.
Okay, in that case, I think we just say a big thank you again to Barrie for such an interesting lecture. I mean, really, even after 10 years, I think we're just scraping the surface of what's going on in Ballynahatty. There's so much more to come out from this, but I say, well done for in 1989, I think when you flew over it, spotted that there was so much more in the landscape, which has certainly been confirmed by David Craig's fantastic drone photography as well. But I think there's enough to keep archaeologists busy in Northern Ireland for many, many generations to come. So just to be a hell of a thank. Just before we go, if we could just mention a couple of things. Firstly, if anybody's interested in buying Barrie's book, there is a discount available from Oxbow Books until the end of this month. If you're interested in
may I just correct you slightly there?
Oh, please do.